The grocery bags were cutting into my fingers by the time I reached the third floor, and my purse had somehow twisted itself around my shoulder in a way that made fishing for my keys nearly impossible. I set the bags down with more force than necessary, the sound echoing through the narrow hallway of our aging apartment building. The fluorescent light above flickered. It had been doing that for weeks, casting everything in an unsteady, institutional glow. I was crouched down, digging through my purse with increasing frustration when I heard the soft click of a door opening behind me. "Everything all right?" The voice was careful, measured, the kind of voice that thought before speaking. I turned to see David emerging from 3B, the apartment directly across from mine. We'd exchanged pleasantries maybe half a dozen times in the 8 months I'd lived here, mostly about packages left in the lobby or the building's various maintenance issues. "Just the usual key situation," I said, finally locating them beneath my wallet and a crumpled receipt from the bookstore where I worked. "You know how it is. The elevator's still broken, I assume?" he asked, glancing toward the stairwell. "Third week running. Mrs. Chen from the first floor said the landlord's looking into it, which basically means never." I managed to get my key into the lock, then turned back to grab my groceries. "At least it's good exercise, right?" David's smile was polite but distant. "Right?" There was something in his tone not dismissive. "Exactly, but like he was going through the motions of normal conversation." I found myself studying his face as I balanced the grocery bags. He had good bone structure, the kind of face that probably looked distinguished in business meetings. But up close, I could see the faint lines around his eyes, the slight tension in his jaw. He looked like someone who spent a lot of time thinking. I said, suddenly aware that I was staring. "Have a good evening, you two, Maya." The fact that he remembered my name caught me off guard. I was still thinking about it as I unpacked my groceries, arranging them in my tiny kitchen with its outdated appliances and limited counter space. Most of my neighbors were polite but forgettable, the kind of people you see in passing and exchange weather-related small talk with. But there had been something about the way David said my name. It's like he'd been holding on to it. A week later, I was in the building's basement laundry room, feeding quarters into the ancient washing machine and wondering why I'd chosen to live. In a building that seemed frozen in 1987, the fluorescent lights down here were even worse than the ones upstairs, buzzing constantly and giving everything a sickly yellow tint. I was sorting through my darks when I heard footsteps on the stairs. David appeared with a navy laundry basket, looking slightly embarrassed. "Sorry," he said, hesitating at the bottom of the stairs. "I didn't realize anyone was down here." "It's fine," I said, gesturing around the cramped room with its 2 washing machines and single folding table. "There's plenty of space for both of us." He nodded and moved to the machine next to mine, pulling out what looked like a carefully sorted load of whites. I tried not to watch as he measured detergent with the kind of precision I usually reserved for baking. "Tide?" he asked, noticing my bottle on the folding table. "The generic stuff, actually. Tide's a little out of my budget range." I immediately regretted admitting that Tit felt too personal for laundry room conversation. "Smart," he said. My ex-wife insisted on the expensive brands for everything. Detergent, fabric softener, even dryer sheets. Claimed she could tell the difference. He paused, and I caught something bitter in his voice. $50 a month on laundry supplies, for no good reason. It was the first time I'd heard him mention being divorced, though I'd noticed he lived alone. There was something vulnerable about the admission, like he hadn't meant to say it out loud. "That's rough," I said, because I didn't know what else to say. "The divorce, I mean, not the expensive detergent." He laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. The expensive detergent was actually the least of our problems. I wanted to ask more, but something in his posture suggested the conversation was over. We finished loading our machines in silence, the rhythmic sound of water filling the drums, creating a strange intimacy in the small space. When I left, he was still standing there, staring at nothing in particular. 2 days later, I was struggling up the stairs with my laundry basket when David's door opened again. This time, he didn't ask if I needed help. He just stepped forward and took the basket from my hands. "Thank you," I said, slightly breathless from the climb. "I swear this thing gets heavier every week. Maybe it's the building's revenge for the broken elevator," he said. And I was surprised by the hint of humor in his voice. We walked the few steps to my door, and I fumbled with my keys again. There was something about his presence that made me hyper-aware of my own movements, like I was performing normal tasks for an audience. "Can I ask you something?" I said as I got the door open. "Sure. You ever feel like everyone else figured out some manual for adult life that you missed?" The question came out more vulnerable than I'd intended. But something about the quiet hallway made honesty feel safer. David set my laundry basket down just inside my doorway, considering my question. "Seriously, what makes you ask that?" I shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. I don't know. My ex-boyfriend was always making comments about how I didn't know how to do things right. In relationships, there was some secret knowledge everyone else had access to. What kind of things? The question was gentle, curious rather than prying, and I found myself wanting to answer honestly. Double quotes. Just ... everything, really. He said I was too eager, too inexperienced. That I didn't know how to please a man. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. As soon as the words left my mouth, "Sorry, that's probably too much information for a Tuesday evening." David was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had a different quality, lower, more thoughtful. "Young girls these days don't know how to please a man." The statement hung in the air between us, and I felt something shift. Not offense, which is what I probably should have felt, but curiosity. Challenge, maybe. "Is that right?" I said, meeting his eyes directly. The silence that followed was charged with something I couldn't name. David's expression changed, like he was seeing me for the first time, and I realized we'd stepped into territory neither of us had intended to explore. He started, then stopped. "I should let you get to your evening, David. I'm sorry, Maya. That was inappropriate." He was already backing toward his own door, but his eyes hadn't left mine. "I didn't mean to. Good night." His door closed, with a soft click, leaving me standing in my doorway with my heart beating faster than the 3 flights of stairs warranted. I should have felt offended by his comment, or at least annoyed by his assumption. Instead, I found myself replaying the moment over and over, the way his voice had dropped. The intensity in his eyes when I'd challenged him. The electricity in that brief silence. I spent the rest of the evening folding laundry and trying to understand why his words had intrigued me instead of insulted me. Why I kept thinking about the careful way he'd said my name. And why I was already looking forward to our next accidental encounter in the hallway. 3 days passed before I heard from David again, and I spent every one of them replaying our hallway conversation. I caught myself listening for his footsteps in the morning, timing my grocery runs to coincide with when I thought he might be coming or going. It was pathetic, really like having a crush in high school, but I couldn't stop thinking about. The way he'd looked at me when I'd challenged him, the knock on my door Thursday evening was so soft I almost missed it. When I opened it, David was standing there with 2 steaming coffee mugs, looking slightly sheepish. "I made too much coffee," he said, which was obviously a lie. "Thought you might want some." I stepped aside to let him in, acutely aware of how small my apartment must seem compared to his. My kitchen could barely fit 2 people, but David settled into one of my mismatched chairs like he belonged there. "This is nice," he said, looking around at my collection of secondhand furniture and the photographs I'd taped to the refrigerator. "Very lived in." "That's a polite way of saying messy," I said, accepting the coffee. It was perfect strong, but not bitter, with just a hint of something I couldn't identify. "I meant it feels like home," he said quietly. "Mine feels like a hotel room most of the time." There was something in his voice that made me look at him more carefully. In the warm light of my kitchen lamp, the tension in his face was more apparent. And I realized this wasn't just a neighborly gesture. "How long have you been divorced?" I asked. 8 months. Finalized, anyway. We were separated for almost a year before that. He wrapped his hands around the mug like he was trying to warm them. She was having an affair with her personal trainer. Very cliché, I know. I'm sorry. The worst part wasn't even the cheating, he continued, staring into his coffee. It was realizing how long I'd been invisible to her. She told me during one of our last fights that I was boring, that I'd stopped trying to be interesting years ago. He looked up at me. Maybe she was right. I wanted to tell him that was ridiculous. That anyone could see he was intelligent and thoughtful and definitely not boring. Instead, I found myself saying my ex told me I was too needy, that I wanted too much attention, too much reassurance. He said it was exhausting. That's not neediness, David said firmly. That's wanting to be valued. Something loosened in my chest at his words. I kept thinking if I could just figure out what he wanted, if I could be better at everything, maybe he'd actually want to be with me. You shouldn't have to perform for someone's attention. The certainty in his voice made me look at him more closely. Is that what happened with your wife? You stopped performing? I think I never started. I thought being reliable and successful was enough. I forgot that marriages need more than just stability. He paused. I forgot that people need to feel desired, not just ... provided for. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and I realized this was the most honest conversation I'd had with anyone in months. Not even Jess knew how much my breakup had shaken my confidence, how it had left me questioning everything about myself. You for the coffee? I said finally. Thank you for letting me drink it here. The coffee visits became a pattern. David would appear at my door every few days, always with some excuse. He'd made too much dinner. He had a bottle of wine that needed drinking. He'd found a book he thought I'd like. I started looking forward to these evenings more than I probably should have. Our conversations grew longer, more intimate. David told me about his work as an architect, how he'd spent years designing buildings he'd never live in, spaces for other people's lives. I told him about the bookstore, how I felt stuck between college and whatever came next, watching my friends move into careers and relationships while I felt increasingly left behind. Sometimes I feel like everyone else got some handbook on how to be an adult, I said one evening, curled up on my small couch while David sat in the armchair across from me. Like there are all these unspoken rules about dating and careers and life that I just missed somehow. I thought I had that handbook, David said. Turns out it was completely wrong. What do you mean? I followed all the steps. Good education, stable career, marriage, house in the suburbs. I checked every box I was supposed to check, and it all fell apart anyway. He was wearing a soft gray sweater that made his eyes look darker, and I found myself studying the way his hands moved when he talked. There was something hypnotic about his careful gestures, his measured way of speaking. Do you ever feel invisible? He asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? Like you're going through the motions of interacting with people, but nobody really sees you. They see what they expect to see, your age, your job, whatever, but not actually you. I thought about my ex-boyfriend, how he'd seemed more interested in molding me into what he wanted than in discovering who I actually was. Yeah, I said softly. I know exactly what you mean. I started to think maybe my ex-wife was right. Maybe I really had become boring, invisible. But when I talk to you, he paused, looking directly at me. I feel like you actually listen. Like you're interested in what I have to say. I am interested. Something shifted in the air between us. David was looking at me like he was seeing something he hadn't noticed before, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks. Maya, he said, his voice softer now. Yeah. But before he could continue, we heard voices in the hallway, my neighbor Mrs. Patterson arguing with someone about a parking space. The moment broke, and David sat back in his chair. I should probably head home, he said, but he made no move. To leave? You don't have to. I know. We looked at each other for a long moment, both aware that something was building between us. Something that probably shouldn't be happening. But neither of us seemed willing to break the spell. Jess showed up unannounced on a Saturday afternoon, the way she always did, armed with takeout containers and gossip from the bookstore. I was grateful for the distraction I'd been thinking about David all morning, wondering if I was imagining the tension between us. Who's the hottie in the hallway? She asked the moment she walked in. My stomach dropped. What? Tall, dark, and distinguished looking? He was checking his mail when I came up, very sexy in an older man kind of way. That's just my neighbor David, I said, trying to sound casual while arranging the Thai food on my counter. Just your neighbor? Maya, that man is gorgeous. And he looked at you like... She paused, tilting her head. Actually, how does he know? We've talked a few times, building stuff, you know. I busied myself getting plates from the cabinet, avoiding her eyes. He seems really kind, she continued. Asked if I was a friend of yours, said you were lovely. Very polite, very, I don't know, grown up. Guilt twisted in my stomach. Jess had been my best friend since freshman year of college, and I'd never kept secrets from her before. But how could I explain that I was developing feelings for a man 16 years older than me? A man who was probably just being neighborly, who probably saw me as a kid playing at being an adult. He's nice, I said. Finally nice. Maya, did you see the way he was looking at you? Like really looking at you? I had seen it, but I had convinced myself I was imagining it. Jess, he's divorced and in his late 30s. I'm sure he's not interested in some 22-year-old who works part-time at a bookstore. Are you interested in him? The question hung in the air, and I realized I couldn't lie to her. It doesn't matter what I'm interested in. That's not what I asked. I met her eyes, and she must have seen something there because her expression grew serious. Maya, please tell me you're not developing feelings for your significantly older neighbor. I'm not, I said, but the words felt hollow. Good, she said, but she was still watching me carefully, because that would be complicated. That evening, David knocked on my door again, and I let him in, even though Jess's warnings were still echoing in my head. We settled into our usual spots, me on the couch, him in the armchair, but something felt different, more charged. Your friend seems nice, he said. She is. She thinks you're distinguished. Distinguished. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That's what women say when they mean old. That's not what she meant, isn't it? He leaned forward slightly. Maya, can I ask you something? Sure. When you were with your ex-boyfriend, did you ever feel like he really wanted you? Not just the idea of having a girlfriend, but you specifically? The question was so intimate, so direct, that it took me a moment to process it. I know, actually. I always felt like I was auditioning for the part. That's what I thought. His voice was quiet now, almost a whisper. You deserve to be with someone who can't believe their luck. The words hit me like a physical touch. I could feel my heart beating faster, could see the way David's eyes had darkened. David, I said, but I wasn't sure what I was trying to say. He stood up then, moving to sit beside me on the couch. We'd never been this close before, and I could smell his cologne, could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. You have no... The idea how beautiful you are, he said softly, his hand moving toward my face. I held my breath, waiting for his fingers to touch my cheek, wanting it more than I'd ever wanted anything. The space between us felt electric, charged with possibility. But at the last second, he pulled his hand back and stood up abruptly. This isn't right, he said, running a hand through his hair. I'm sorry, Maya. I shouldn't have. I should go. David, wait. But he was already at the door, leaving me sitting alone on the couch. My skin still tingling from his almost touch, my mind reeling from what had just happened, and what might have happened if he hadn't stopped himself. I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, trying to understand why I felt more disappointed than relieved. The week that followed our almost moment felt like an eternity stretched thin. I'd catch glimpses of David in the hallway checking his mail when I knew he'd already collected it, lingering by the elevator that still wasn't working, and we'd exchange the kind of polite nods that felt like lies. But I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the careful distance he maintained, the way his eyes would find mine for just a fraction of a second too long. He was fighting the same battle I was, trying to pretend that electric moment on my couch had been an aberration rather than an inevitable conclusion we'd been building toward for months. I threw myself into distractions, extra shifts at the bookstore, deep cleaning my apartment, calling my sister to catch up on family gossip I didn't actually care about. But every activity felt hollow, like I was going through the motions of my life, while the most important part of it remained suspended in limbo. I kept replaying the moment when David had almost touched my face, wondering what would have happened if he hadn't pulled away. If he'd crossed that line we'd both been pretending didn't exist. By Thursday evening, I couldn't stand it anymore. I found myself in my kitchen at 9 o'clock, mixing chocolate chip cookie dough with the kind of aggressive efficiency that suggested. I was beating the batter into submission rather than preparing a peace offering. My grandmother's recipe was muscle memory by no butter, brown sugar, vanilla extract. The careful fold of chocolate chips that she'd taught me when I was 8. But tonight it felt like a ritual, a concrete action, in a week that had been nothing but uncertainty. The cookies were still warm when I arranged them on a plate and covered them with aluminum foil. It was a transparent excuse, and we both knew it. But I needed some reason to stand at David's door that didn't involve admitting I'd spent 7 days thinking about the way. His voice had dropped when he told me I deserved to be with someone who couldn't believe their luck. When David opened his door, he looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. His hair was slightly mussed, his usual composed appearance softened around the edges, and there was something vulnerable about the way he looked at me standing there with my offering. "I made too many cookies," I said, echoing his coffee excuse from what felt like a lifetime ago. His smile was rueful, tinged with something that might have been relief. "Of course you did. Can I come in?" The hesitation was so brief I might have imagined it, but then he was stepping aside, holding the door open wider. "Please." David's apartment was a revelation that shouldn't have surprised me, but did. My space was an explosion of books and plants and photographs taped to every available surface. His was a study in careful restraint. The furniture looked expensive, but impersonal, sleek lines in neutral colors that could have been pulled from a high-end hotel catalog. Abstract art hung on walls painted in shades of gray and beige, and I realized with a pang of sadness that there wasn't a single personal photograph visible anywhere. "This is beautiful," I said, though the perfection of it made something in my chest tighten. "My ex-wife's decorator," he said, following my gaze around the room. I kept meaning to change it after she left, but I never knew what I actually wanted it to look like. I set the cookies on his pristine kitchen counter and watched him move through the space like he was visiting rather than living there. Everything was so controlled, so carefully curated, the opposite of the man who'd sat in my cluttered kitchen and told me about feeling invisible. "David," I said finally, "we need to talk about what happened the other night." Stop moving. His back to me as he stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the building's courtyard. "I know I owe you an apology for my behavior." "No, you don't." It made him turn around, and I could see surprise flicker across his features. "I've been thinking about you," I said, the words coming out in a rush before I could lose my nerve. "I know I shouldn't be. I know this whole situation is complicated and probably impossible, but I can't stop thinking about you." Something shifted in his expression, not quite relief, but like he'd been holding his breath and could finally exhale. "Every morning I listen for your footsteps in the hallway," he continued, needing to get it all out before my courage failed me. "I time my grocery runs, hoping I'll run into you. I find excuses to check my mail when I think you might be getting yours. And that night, when you were going to touch my face, I wanted you to. I've never wanted anything more in my life, and it scared me how much I wanted it." David moved closer, stopping just out of arm's reach, his dark eyes searching my face. "Maya, this isn't simple for either of us. I know. I'm 16 years older than you. I'm divorced, probably damaged in ways I don't even recognize yet. People would judge us, judge you especially. They'd assume things about both of us that aren't true, or maybe are true, and I don't know which would be worse. I know that too. Then why are you here?" I looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the careful way he held himself. The loneliness he tried so hard to disguise behind composure, the intelligence that lit up his eyes when he talked about things he cared about. "Because when I'm with you, I feel like the person I'm supposed to be. Not too eager, not too inexperienced, not to anything. Just me. The version of me I actually like." David closed the distance between us then, his hands coming up to frame my face the way he'd started to do a week ago. His palms were warm against my cheeks, his thumbs tracing along my cheekbones with a gentleness that made my breath catch. "You have no idea how long it's been since someone made me feel interesting," he said softly. "Since someone listened to me talk and actually seemed to care what I thought, seemed to want to understand how I see the world. I do care. I want to understand everything about how you think. I know you do. That's what makes this so complicated." His thumbs continued their gentle movement across my skin, and I felt myself leaning into the touch like a plant turning toward sunlight. "Maya, if we do this, if we cross this line, everything changes between us. Are you sure that's what you want?" Instead of answering with words, I stood on my toes and kissed him. It wasn't like any kiss I'd experienced before. The boys I dated had been all urgency and competing tongues, like kissing was a race they needed to win. David's mouth was warm and patient against mine, his hand steady on my face as he kissed me back with a tenderness that made my chest ache. There was something reverent about the way he touched me, like I was something precious he was afraid of breaking. Like he couldn't quite believe I was real and there and wanting this as much as he did. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathing hard, foreheads touching as we tried to process what had just happened. That was ... started, then stopped, not sure how to finish the sentence. Different, David said, understanding exactly what I meant. Very different. Good. Different. His laugh was soft, slightly breathless. It's very good different. We stood there for a moment, neither of us moving away, both processing the significance of the line we'd just crossed. I could feel it like something physical, a boundary that had existed between us dissolving, placed by possibility and complication. In equal measure, we'll have to be careful, David said eventually, his voice quiet but certain, discreet. I nodded, understanding the implications without needing them spelled out. Jess can't know. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She'd worry about the age difference, about whether you're taking advantage of me or I'm having some kind of crisis. My business partners are fairly conservative. If word got out about us, it could affect my reputation, my career. I know how. That sounds... but it doesn't sound bad. It sounds practical. I paused. My family would lose their minds. They still think I need to find a nice boy my own age and settle down into the kind of life they understand. David's smile was rueful. A nice boy. Not a divorced man with baggage and a mortgage and more emotional complications than anyone should have to deal with. You're not baggage, I said firmly, surprised by the fierceness in my own voice. And I don't want a nice boy my own age. I want you. This, whatever this is going to be. Became more focused, Maya. You need to be absolutely sure about what you're saying. Because once we start this, once we cross into whatever comes next, I don't think I'll be able to go back to polite hallway conversations and pretending. I don't know how you taste. The directness of his words sent heat spiraling through me. Don't want to go back. Want to go forward, even if it's complicated, even if we have to hide it. He kissed me again then, deeper this time, with less restraint. And I felt something unlock in my chest that I hadn't even realized was closed. This was what had been missing with every other person I'd tried to connect with, this sense of being truly wanted. Not just as a warm body or a conquest or someone to fill time with, but as myself, specifically and entirely. What followed over. The next few weeks was a careful courtship conducted in whispers and stolen moments. David would text me when he was making dinner, casual messages that anyone reading over my shoulder would find innocent but that I understood were invitations, and show up at his door with a bottle of wine from the corner store or leftover pastries from the bookstore, and we'd spend hours talking about everything and nothing while learning the geography of each other's lives. He taught me about things. I'd never had access to wine that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, classical music that required patience to appreciate, art that revealed new layers the longer you looked at it. But he never made me feel stupid for not knowing these things already. Instead, he seemed genuinely delighted by my reactions, by the questions I asked, by the connections I made between ideas in return. I brought something to his carefully ordered world that had been missing: spontaneity, curiosity, a willingness to try new things just because they might be interesting. I convinced him to order takeout from the Ethiopian place down the street, to take walks through neighborhoods he'd never explored, to tell me stories about buildings we passed and what he might have done differently if he'd designed them. Our physical relationship developed slowly, with David always checking to make sure I was comfortable, never pushing for more than I was ready to give. His experience was evident not in technique, but in patience, in the way he seemed to understand that good intimacy couldn't be rushed. That trust had to be built one careful touch at a time. "You don't have to be perfect," he told me one evening, as we lay together on his couch, my head on his chest, both of us still partially clothed and learning the feel of each other's skin. "You don't have to perform for me or prove anything. I want to be good at this," I said. "Want to be enough for you, Maya." Tilted my chin up so I had to meet his eyes, and the intensity there took my breath away. "You're not just enough. You're everything I didn't know I was missing." As the weeks passed, I began to understand what he meant. In David's careful attention, in the way he listened to my thoughts like they mattered, in the reverence with which he touched me, I was discovering what it meant to be cherished rather than simply desired, and in watching him come alive during our conversations, seeing him laugh more freely and express opinions he'd kept carefully hidden, I realized I was witnessing someone remember who they used to be before disappointment taught them to expect. Lest we were crossing lines neither of us had planned to cross, venturing into territory that would require more secrecy and sacrifice than either of us had bargained for. But as I fell asleep in David's arms, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next, whatever complications we'd have to navigate, this feeling was worth protecting. Even if we had to. Hide it from everyone else, even if we had to exist in the spaces between other people's expectations. What we'd found together felt more real than anything I'd ever experienced. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be, seen completely and accepted entirely. And I wasn't about to let that go. Retroclaude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses by October. 3 months into whatever we were calling this thing between us, David and I had developed an intricate dance of discretion. We'd learned each other's schedules with the precision of intelligence operatives. He left for work at 7:15 every morning. I didn't get home from the bookstore until after 6 on weekdays. Our grocery runs were carefully staggered, our comings and goings timed to avoid simultaneous appearances in the hallway. The elaborate choreography should have felt exhausting, but instead it had become oddly romantic. There was something thrilling about the secret glances we'd exchange when we passed in the lobby, the way David's fingers would brush mine when he handed me mail that had been misdelivered, the coded text messages we'd developed. "Do you need anything from the store?" meant "Can I see you tonight?" "I'm making too much dinner again," was our signal for a quiet evening together. I'd become surprisingly skilled at deflection, especially with Jess, who had developed an annoying habit of commenting on my improved mood. "You're glowing," she said one afternoon, as we restocked shelves at the bookstore. "Like actually glowing? Are you using some new skincare routine? It's just getting more sleep." I lied, shelving a stack of romance novels with more force than necessary. "You've been so confident lately. Remember how you used to overthink every customer interaction? Now, you're giving book recommendations like you actually know what you're talking about." She wasn't wrong. Something had shifted in me over the past few months, a sense of self-assurance I'd never possessed before. David had a way of listening to my thoughts about books and life and people that made me feel intelligent, interesting. His encouragement had translated into real changes. I'd started reading more challenging literature, had begun writing reviews for the store's blog, had even suggested new events to our manager. "Maybe I'm just growing up," I said, which was true, though not in the way Jess assumed. "Well, whatever it is, keep it up." I seemed really happy. I was happy in a way that felt both wonderful and terrifying. Every evening spent curled up on David's couch, talking about everything from architecture to philosophy to our childhood dreams, felt like a gift I didn't deserve. The way he looked at me when I expressed an opinion like my thoughts mattered had begun to change how I saw myself. For the first time in my life, I felt like someone worth listening to. But the constant vigilance was exhausting. We'd perfected the art of existing in parallel, without appearing connected. But it meant that our most natural moments, the way David's face lit up when he saw me, the unconscious way I leaned toward him when he spoke, had to be carefully suppressed in any public space. The first real scare came on a Thursday evening in late October. I was at David's apartment, wearing one of his button-down shirts and nothing else while he cooked dinner, when we heard a familiar voice in the hallway. "Maya, I know you're home. I saw your light on." "Jess." I looked at David in panic, then at the wine glasses on his counter, the evidence of our evenings scattered throughout his previously pristine apartment. "Bathroom," David whispered, already gathering my clothes. Don't come out until she's gone. I locked myself in David's bathroom, heart hammering as I heard him open his door. "Oh, hi," Jess's voice, surprised. "I was looking for Maya. Have you seen her?" "I think she might have gone out," David said, his voice carefully neutral. "I heard her door close earlier." "That's weird. Her lights are on." A pause. "Sorry, I didn't mean to bother you. I'm Jess, by the way, Maya's friend from work." "David, nice to meet you properly." I held my breath, pressed against the bathroom door, terrified that somehow she'd figure it out, that she'd notice David's hair was mussed, or smell the wine on his breath, or simply sense the intimacy that had been filling his apartment moments before. "You seem really familiar," Jess said, and my heart stopped. "Have we met before?" "I don't think so. Though I've seen you visiting Maya, right? Well, if you see her, tell her I stopped by." Of course. The sound of his door closing was followed by the longest 10 minutes of my life, waiting to make sure Jess was really gone. When David finally knocked softly on the bathroom door, I emerged shaking. "That was too close," I said. David pulled me against him, and I could feel his heart beating as fast as mine. "We have to be more careful." The incident left both of us rattled, hyper-aware of how much we had to lose. But it wasn't the only close call. Mother had started asking pointed questions during our weekly phone calls about my dating life, wondering why I seemed so secretive lately. David's mother, during one of her rare visits, had commented on how much happier he seemed, how there was something different about him that she couldn't quite place. "You look like you did when you first started dating Rebecca," she'd said, referring to his ex-wife. "Like, you have a secret." The weight of constant deception was beginning to take its toll on both of us. I found myself lying reflexively to Jess about my evening plans, to my coworkers about why I was suddenly so interested in architecture magazines, to my family about the reason for my improved mood. Each lie felt like another brick in a wall. I was building between my real life and the life everyone else could see. David struggled with it too, in different ways. His guilt manifested as overcompensation, bringing me flowers that I had to hide, planning elaborate dates that we could never actually go on, talking about trips we could take someday to places where no one would know us. "Sometimes I wonder if this is fair to you," he said one evening as we lay in his bed, my head on his chest. "You should be out there, meeting people your own age, having experiences you don't have to hide." "Is that what you want?" I asked, lifting my head to look at him. For me to date other people? The flash of possessiveness in his eyes was immediate and unmistakable. "No, God, no." "Then don't tell me what I should want." But even as I said it, I couldn't deny that the secrecy was wearing on me. I wanted to tell Jess about the way David made me coffee in the mornings, wanted to call my sister and gush about how he'd spent an entire evening reading my favorite poetry aloud. I wanted to be able to touch his hand when we passed in the hallway, to acknowledge with more than a polite nod that he was the most important person in my world. Despite the guilt and the constant vigilance, there was something profoundly satisfying about our hidden relationship. The apartment building that had once felt like a temporary way station between college and real life had become our sanctuary. Behind closed doors, we existed in a world entirely our own, free from the expectations and judgments that governed our public lives. David told me things in the soft darkness of his bedroom that I was certain he'd never shared with anyone else. About his fears that he was fundamentally unlovable, that his ex-wife's affairs had confirmed some essential inadequacy in him. About his work, the buildings he dreamed of designing but never pitched because they seemed too risky, too personal. About his childhood in a household where emotions were considered weaknesses and love was expressed through achievement rather than affection. In return, found myself sharing thoughts and dreams I'd barely admitted to myself. My secret ambition to write, the stories I'd started but never finished because they felt too revealing. My fears about growing up, about becoming another adult, going through the motions of a life that didn't really fit. My complicated relationship with my own sexuality, the way previous boyfriends had made me feel simultaneously too much and not enough. "You know what I love about you?" David said one evening, as we sat on his couch, my legs stretched across his lap while he traced abstract patterns on my skin. "What?" "You ask questions I've never heard before?" "Yesterday, You asked me if I think buildings have personalities? Last week you wondered if there's a difference between loneliness and solitude. No one has ever made me think about things the way you do. His words sent warmth spreading through my chest. My ex used to say I asked too many questions. Your ex was an idiot. He said I was exhausting to be around. David's hand stilled on my leg, and when I looked at him, his expression was fierce. Maya, listen to me. You are not exhausting. You're curious and thoughtful and passionate about ideas. Anyone who finds that exhausting doesn't deserve your attention. It was moments like these that made all the secrecy worthwhile. The way David looked at me when I expressed an opinion like my thoughts were genuinely interesting, rather than something to be tolerated. The patience he showed when I was working through a complex idea, never rushing me or making me feel stupid. For taking time to articulate what I meant, it's the genuine delight he took in my perspectives. Especially when they challenged his own assumptions. Our physical relationship had evolved too, becoming something entirely different from the fumbling encounters of my past. David approached my body with the same careful attention he brought to everything else, learning what I liked with a thoroughness that sometimes overwhelmed me. There was no urgency in him, no sense that I needed to perform or prove anything. Instead, there was a reverence that made me feel beautiful in a way I'd never experienced. You're staring, I said one evening, catching him watching me as I read in his bed. Sorry, I just... ... Double quotes, he shook his head. I can't believe you're here. Where else would I be? Out there, living the life a 22-year-old is supposed to live. Dating guys who can take you places, introduce you to their friends, meet your parents. I set my book aside and moved closer to him. David, do you think I don't know what I'm giving up? I think you might not realize how much it is. Then you're underestimating me. I took his face in my hands, forcing him to meet my eyes. I've dated guys my own age. I know what that looks like. Surface level, conversations about nothing, physical, connections with no emotional intimacy, relationships where I spend more time trying to figure out what they want me to be than discovering who I actually am. This thing we have? It's worth more than all of that combined. David studied my face for a long moment, and I could see him weighing my words against his own fears. I just don't want you to wake up in 5 years and regret this, he said finally. The only thing I'd regret is letting you go, because other people think I should. Acceptance and resolution winter arrived early that year, and with it came a shift in our relationship, in intensity, but in acceptance. The careful anxiety that had characterized our first months together gradually gave way to something steadier, more sustainable. We stopped talking about the temporary nature of our situation and started making long-term plans. Quietly and without much fanfare, David helped me apply to graduate programs in creative writing, spending hours reviewing my application essays and encouraging me to pursue dreams I'd barely admitted to myself. I convinced him to submit his portfolio to a competition for innovative residential design, pushing him to take risks he'd been avoiding since his divorce. I got in. I told him one February evening, waving the acceptance letter from the state university, the MFA program. They're offering me a teaching assistantship. David's face lit up with pride, and for a moment I forgot about discretion. Throwing my arms around him right there in the hallway, it wasn't until Mrs. Patterson's door opened that we remembered ourselves stepping apart with the practiced casualness we'd perfected. Congratulations, dear, Mrs. Patterson said, eyeing us both with the sharp attention of someone who'd lived through decades of building drama. That's wonderful news. Thank you, I said, my cheeks burning. Later, alone in David's apartment, we celebrated properly with champagne. He'd been saving for a special occasion, and a quiet conversation about what my acceptance meant for us. Program starts in the fall, I said, curled against his side on the couch. I'll have to move across town, closer to campus. It's 40 minutes away. I know. We sat in silence, both processing the implications. After months of existing in the same building, of being able to see each other with elaborate but manageable secrecy, the idea of real distance felt daunting. We'll figure it out, David said finally. If this is what you want, if I'm what you want, we'll make it work. Is that what you want, to make it work? He turned to face me fully, his expression serious. Now, 6 months ago, I was convinced I was going to spend the rest of my life alone. Not just unmarried, but actually alone, going through the motions of work and social obligations without any real connection to another person. You changed that. You made me remember what it feels like to be excited about coming home, to have someone to share ideas with, to feel like the best version of myself. Even though we have to hide. Though I hope, someday, we won't have to. The conversation marked a turning point for both of us. We stopped framing our relationship as a temporary aberration and started thinking of it as something worth protecting long term. The secrecy would continue to be challenging, but it no longer felt like a burden we were carrying instead. It became simply one of the conditions of something we'd both decided was too valuable to lose. I realized I'd grown into someone I barely recognized, from the insecure young woman who'd struggled up the stairs with her laundry basket 8 months earlier. David's faith in my intelligence had given me confidence I'd never possessed. His genuine interest in my thoughts had taught me that my opinions were worth expressing. His patience with my inexperience had shown me the difference between being wanted and being cherished. Spring came late that year. But when it finally arrived, it transformed our neighborhood into something almost magical. The building's courtyard, which had been a patch of dead grass and bare trees all winter, suddenly burst into bloom. I was sitting by my window, working on a short story for my portfolio, when Jess knocked on my door. "You look different," she said the moment I let her in, settling onto my couch with her usual lack of ceremony. "Different? How?" "I don't know. Confident. Like you know something the rest of us don't." She studied my face with the intensity she usually reserved for analyzing customer behavior at the bookstore. "Are you seeing someone?" The question hung between us, and for a moment I considered telling her everything. About David, about the way he made me feel, about the relationship that had taught me more about myself than all my previous experiences combined. But the habit of secrecy was too strong, the risks too real. "I'm just happy," I said instead, which was true. "Well, whatever it is, it suits you. You've got this glow, this sense of, contentment. Like you've figured out some secret about life." After she left, I found myself thinking about her words. Had I figured out some secret? Maybe not about life in general, but about my own life, about what I needed and wanted and valued. 6 months earlier, I'd been a young woman who apologized for her own opinions, who twisted herself into shapes she thought others wanted to see. Now I was someone who knew her own worth, who could express her thoughts without preemptive disclaimers, who understood the difference between compromise and self-erasure. The sound of David's key in his lock made me look up from my writing. Through my peephole, I could see him checking his mail, the familiar ritual of his evening routine. Our eyes met for just a moment, a brief acknowledgement across the hallway that we both understood. Later, after the building had settled into its evening quiet, we'd find our way to each other again. We'd share dinner and conversation. He'd ask about my writing. I'd tell him about my day at the bookstore.